you have legal questions. Amy the attorney has the answers. Welcome to today's show. And here's Amy.
I want you to talk about not only the medical stuff, but also pain and suffering and what goes into your evaluation of what the case is worth, assuming that you have no insurance limitations.
If your back is injured and you can't roughhouse with your toddler anymore, if you're a runner and you can't go for a jog anymore because there's something wrong with your knee after the accident, or cosmetic things. I represented a woman who didn't have a lot in the way of medical bills, but glass lacerated her face in multiple places, and she has scars on her forehead and under her left eye, and she's got to look at that every day for the rest of her life. And so she didn't have a significant amount of medical bills, but the emotional impact of that scarring made a big deal, or was a big deal. And then the other piece of the puzzle is the impact that a serious accident can have on your relationship. If you are married in Missouri, your spouse has the right to also make a claim against the at-fault driver for something called loss of consortium, which is an allegation that, hey, you hurting my spouse has impacted our relationship. We can't go on walks together. We can't go on vacation together. Our intimacy has been impacted. All of those things come into play. And so I hate to give like a really sort of wishy-washy answer, but you don't know what the worth of a case is until you have looked under every stone with respect to the things that I'm talking about.
Okay, so can you walk me through or tell the story, obviously without divulging any kind of information that would, breach attorney-client privilege, but can you walk me through a story of an injured person from a car wreck that you've represented?
Sure. Boy, it's hard to pick. It really is hard to pick because they're all kind of floating in my head at once. But I'll try to give you an example of somebody who really probably presents as a more typical case. So a woman was a passenger in a car that was rear-ended at a high rate of speed. She ended up hitting the dashboard and having a split in her head and needing staples in her head. So she was taken to the emergency room. The at-fault driver at the scene didn't have any insurance and was ticketed for having no insurance. And they went probably a month sort of wringing their hands over, oh my gosh, how are we going to pay these medical bills? They didn't have uninsured motorist coverage. So they thought they were essentially out of luck when they called me. And the first thing I did was I found out where the accident happened, what police department was on the scene, and then I called the prosecutor's office in that jurisdiction and found out that the at-fault driver with a lawyer showed up, provided proof of insurance, and got that ticket dismissed. So I had the clerk send me over a copy of the insurance card, and then we were off to the races. I sent a notice of representation to the insurance company and found out what the policy limits were. My client, who went to the ER and had staples put in her head, only had one other doctor's visit, and the staples were taken out and her hair grew back. She looked fine. Everybody thought that was the end of it. But she continued to talk about numbness in her right leg. And it was from the impact of the collision and the way she braced herself on impact. And she just said something was not right. And her doctors just, said, you look fine to me. Your x-ray was negative. Like, I don't know what to tell you. And I suggested that she go to a neurologist and have a nerve conduction study. And that's kind of, it's called an EMG. E as in E and then M as in Mary, G, an EMG. And it determines whether your nerves are working as they should, whether there's a steady stream of communication going all the way down your limb. Well, sure enough, this woman had nerve damage, permanent nerve damage. And once I was able to find that out, I was quickly able to settle the case for policy limits. And the policy limits, I think in that case, were only $50,000. But she got every penny of it. And because I was able to do it in pretty short order with just, a few phone calls and not much in the way of out-of-pocket expenses, I took less than the contingency fee I even agreed to take, which I don't do all the time. I mean, I've got a family to feed and I do good work. But sometimes there are cases where I feel like my job was pretty limited and all I had to do was make a couple of phone calls or send a couple of letters. And I think, why should I take a ton of that person's money? They're the ones that are hurt. But that's a good example of a recent case that I was able to settle. Sometimes you get at the opposite end of the spectrum and you have a denial of liability and you have to file a lawsuit and it's a fight that lasts a year and a half or more. So there is no typical case, really. I mean, they run the extremes for sure.
I think that, just from my being in the courthouse, I think that it could be several years before you saw a jury or saw a courtroom. Does that seem, just between the discovery and finding out all the information and everything and actually getting something scheduled in court, which a trial, depending on the location, it can be hard to schedule, but it could be a couple years before you actually, if it went that far, got to a jury.
That's true. And the dragging out of a case in the court system isn't the lawyer's fault. It certainly isn't always the lawyer's fault. It can be. But even in cases where I immediately file a lawsuit and we immediately do discovery and depositions, by the time you get to mediation, which is sort of an attempt to settle the case before a trial date, it's not uncommon for 9 months or a year to go by. And some of that is because the process just has inherent delays in it. When you file a lawsuit and serve it, it takes 30 days before you even find out who the lawyer is going to be on the case. And then sometimes that lawyer says, hey, I need more time to file an answer. And then it might be another month before you go in front of a judge and start scheduling things. And then the court schedule impacts when your case is set for trial. And then deadlines are set relative to that trial date. And so it can take a long time. And the thing that I impress upon my clients is this. Everything in life is sort of a balancing act. And there is an emotional price that clients pay for their case dragging out for a long period of time, being questioned repeatedly, put under the microscope, worrying about what's going to happen. And also going to trial and preparing for trial costs money. Hiring experts to evaluate my client. The insurance company will hire a doctor to do their own medical examination of my clients in some circumstances. Other experts might be needed. So the litigation expenses increase rapidly. And that hurts my client. My client pays or gets less money out of a settlement if case expenses are high. So I'm constantly evaluating whether it's better to try to get my client a certain sum of money now that makes them whole, that's something they can live with, versus gambling with that money, essentially, and dragging things out for a year, running up case expenses, and not putting them in a significantly better position. There are cases where the top offer might be $75,000, let's say. And the client is like, well, I'm hurt worse than that. I want $125,000. Well, you could go to trial and get $125,000. But if you win, the other side is going to appeal. And an appeal might take 2 years past your trial date. So all that time, you don't have any money. And the cost of litigating a case, hiring experts, taking all the depositions, doing everything that you have to do to get a case ready the way a trial lawyer like me thinks a case ought to be prepared, that's going to eat up a chunk of the money that you get. And so, yes, you might get a $125,000 verdict, but you might wait years to get that money, and you're going to lose some of that in case expenses. And you might have been better off just taking the $75,000 and realizing that sometimes a bird in the hand is better than anything else. So every case is different. And so when my clients are faced with settle a case for X dollars or go to trial, I actually have a spreadsheet that I show them that shows them, wow, settling your case for X dollars now is as good or better than waiting 2 years to get a little bit more money.